The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of Gate 17 at JFK International Airport, its crystal fragments catching the harsh fluorescent lights like tiny diamonds scattered across a battlefield. But nobody noticed the mess, because at that exact moment, 37,000 feet above the churning Atlantic Ocean, Richard Montgomery Blackstone III was dying. The Boeing 777's first-class cabin had been a sanctuary of whispered conversations and clinking silverware just moments before, the kind of rarefied atmosphere where conversations about stock options mixed with discussions of summer homes in the Hamptons. Now it had transformed into a theater of absolute horror, with passengers frozen in their buttery leather seats, watching as one of America's most powerful and feared men clawed desperately at his throat like a wild animal caught in a trap, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson that reminded everyone present of a ripe tomato left too long in the sun. The 72-year-old billionaire's eyes bulged with the kind of terror that transcends social class and bank account balances, his perfectly manicured fingers scratching uselessly at his neck as if he could somehow dig the obstruction out with his bare hands. The diamond cufflinks that had cost more than most people's annual salary caught the cabin lights as his arms flailed helplessly, and his perfectly pressed Armani suit began to wrinkle under the desperate movements of a man facing his own mortality. Emma Rodriguez had been refilling water glasses in her methodical, professional way when she heard the first awful gasping sound that would haunt her dreams for months to come. The 26-year-old flight attendant from Queens had worked for United Airlines for 3 years, navigating the complex social hierarchies of first-class passengers with the grace her mother had taught her and the determination her father had instilled in her through years of working double shifts at their small grocery store. But in all her thousands of hours in the air, serving everyone from Hollywood celebrities to tech moguls to foreign dignitaries, she had never witnessed anything like this moment of raw, primal terror. The lobster thermidor that Mr. Blackstone had been enjoying with such evident pleasure, commenting to his traveling companion about the excellent preparation and asking the chef's name so he could compliment the airline's catering director, now seemed to be killing him with ruthless efficiency. A piece of the succulent crustacean had lodged somewhere in his windpipe like a death sentence written in expensive cuisine, and no amount of money or power or influence could negotiate with the simple biological reality that humans need oxygen to survive. "Oh my God, he's choking! Someone help him! He's actually choking!" screamed Patricia Wellington, a socialite from Manhattan's Upper East Side who occupied seat 2A and whose voice carried the kind of panic that only emerges when someone who has never experienced real danger suddenly finds themselves face to face with mortality. Her perfectly applied makeup began to smear as tears of shock and horror streamed down her cheeks, and her voice cut through the cabin like a knife blade dragged across crystal, shattering the shocked silence and sending ripples of panic through the first-class section like stones thrown into still water. The other passengers seemed paralyzed by the spectacle unfolding before them, their faces frozen in expressions of disbelief and terror. There was Dr. James Morrison, a renowned heart surgeon from Boston who had saved countless lives in operating rooms across New England, but who now found himself speechless and motionless in seat 4B, his medical training somehow abandoned in the face of this unexpected emergency. Margaret Chen, a tech executive from Silicon Valley whose company had revolutionized artificial intelligence, gripped her armrests so tightly her knuckles had turned white as paper, her brilliant mind suddenly unable to process the reality of what was happening just a few feet away from her.
Even Thomas Bradley, a former Navy SEAL who now worked as a private security consultant and who had faced down armed terrorists in 3 different countries, seemed frozen in his seat, his combat-trained reflexes inexplicably failing him in this moment of civilian crisis. The collective paralysis was complete and absolute, as if death itself had cast a spell over the cabin, rendering everyone helpless observers to a tragedy unfolding in real time.
Everyone, that is, except Emma Rodriguez, whose training kicked in like a life-saving reflex, honed through countless hours of safety demonstrations and emergency protocols that most passengers ignored while checking their phones or reading magazines. If you're watching this incredible story unfold, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these amazing tales of human courage and unexpected connections that remind us all of the extraordinary potential that lives within ordinary people. Without hesitation, she dropped the crystal water pitcher she'd been holding, not even noticing as it crashed to the floor and sent water splashing across the expensive carpeting. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she rushed toward the dying billionaire, her low-heeled uniform shoes silent on the plush carpet. The contrast wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a girl whose parents had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but dreams, determination, and a fierce belief in the American promise of opportunity, now racing to save a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations and whose decisions affected the lives of millions of people around the world. Richard Blackstone's face had progressed from red to a frightening shade of purple that reminded Emma of the bruised plums her mother used to examine carefully at the market, searching for ones that were still salvageable. His desperate attempts to breathe created horrible, rattling sounds that seemed to echo through the cabin like the death rattle of some great machine slowly grinding to a halt. Those sounds would haunt the dreams of everyone who heard them, a reminder that money and power offer no protection against the most basic biological needs. "Sir, I need you to stand up," Emma said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the chaos erupting around them and the fact that her own hands were trembling with adrenaline and fear. "I know you're scared. I know this is terrifying, but I'm going to help you. I promise I'm going to help you." Blackstone's terrified eyes met hers across the social chasm that normally separated them, and in that moment, she saw not the ruthless businessman who had built a media empire worth $23 billion through a combination of brilliant strategy and ruthless determination, but simply a frightened old man facing his mortality with the same terror that every human being experiences when death comes knocking unexpectedly. The vulnerability in his eyes was shocking in its intensity, stripping away decades of carefully constructed authority and revealing the scared child that lives somewhere inside every adult, no matter how successful or powerful they might appear to the world. He nodded frantically, using the last reserves of his strength to push himself up from his seat with Emma's assistance, his legs shaky and unsteady beneath him. His expensive cologne mixed with the smell of fear-induced sweat, creating an oddly human scent that reminded everyone watching that beneath the tailored suits and corporate authority, he was just flesh and blood like everyone else. The cabin erupted in nervous chatter as passengers craned their necks to see what was happening, some of them standing in their seats for a better view of the drama unfolding before them. Some pulled out their phones to record the scene, the modern instinct to document tragedy overriding any sense of privacy or dignity. Others whispered prayers under their breath in languages ranging from English to Mandarin to Arabic,
the universal human response to witnessing someone balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. The whispers created a symphony of anxiety. Is he going to die? Where are the doctors? Why isn't anyone doing anything? Should we land the plane? Oh God, oh God, oh God. The voices blended together into a chorus of helplessness, punctuated by the clicking of phone cameras and the rustle of expensive clothing as people shifted nervously in their seats.
The contrast was stark and almost absurd in its social implications. Here was a woman who cleaned her own small apartment in Astoria, who clipped coupons to save money on groceries, who had never owned anything more expensive than the modest engagement ring her ex-boyfriend had given her before their relationship fell apart, now trying to save a man who owned 17 homes across 4 continents, whose art collection was worth more than most museums, and who had never in his adult life performed a single household task for himself. Emma positioned herself behind Blackstone with the precision of someone who had practiced this maneuver dozens of times, but never in a situation where failure meant watching someone die right in front of her. She wrapped her arms around his substantial midsection, feeling the expensive fabric of his shirt and the solid reality of his body beneath her hands. She had practiced the Heimlich maneuver dozens of times during her training, on mannequins and fellow trainees, but never on someone whose life actually depended on her actions, and certainly never on someone whose death would make international headlines within minutes and send shockwaves through financial markets around the world. "This might hurt a little," she whispered close to his ear, her breath warm against his graying hair that was usually styled to perfection but now hung limp with perspiration. She could smell his expensive shampoo and the faint scent of the aftershave that probably cost more than her monthly salary. "But I need you to trust me, okay? I need you to let me help you." Then, with precision born of countless training sessions and a determination forged in the working-class neighborhoods of Queens where giving up was never an option, she placed her fist just below his ribcage and thrust upward with all the strength her 5'4" frame could muster, putting her entire body weight behind the movement. Nothing happened. The purple in Blackstone's face deepened to an almost black shade, and his legs began to buckle like a building whose foundation had been compromised. Emma's mind raced as she repositioned her hands, searching for the correct angle while fighting off the panic that threatened to overwhelm her training. She could feel the weight of every passenger's stare, the pressure of their collective held breath, the terrible responsibility of a human life literally in her hands. What would you do in this situation? Could you stay calm when someone's life depended entirely on your actions? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button to help others discover it too. The second thrust was harder, more desperate, fueled by the growing terror that she might fail, that this man might die right here in her arms while dozens of people watched helplessly. She could hear Patricia Wellington sobbing loudly in the background, her cries mixing with the urgent whispers of other passengers who had begun offering unhelpful suggestions. "Try hitting his back. Turn him upside down. Where's the medical kit?" Still nothing. Blackstone's face was now a shade of blue-black that Emma had never seen on a living human being, and his struggles were growing weaker by the second. "Come on," she muttered through gritted teeth, adjusting her grip once more and trying to remember every detail of her training. "Come on, please, please work." Dr. Morrison finally found his voice from across the aisle, shouting medical advice. "Higher up, aim just below the sternum. Quick, sharp thrusts." But his words seemed to come from very far away, almost drowned out by the rushing sound of Emma's own blood pumping through her ears.
The third attempt came with the fury of desperation and the strength that sometimes emerges in moments of absolute crisis, when ordinary people discover they are capable of extraordinary things. Emma drove her fist upward with such force that she lifted the billionaire's feet completely off the ground, his expensive Italian leather shoes dangling in the air for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. This time, something gave way with a sensation she felt through her entire body. A chunk of lobster the size of a golf ball shot from Blackstone's mouth like a cork from a champagne bottle, arcing through the air in a perfect parabola before landing with a wet, sickening splat on the cabin floor 3 feet away, where it sat like a small piece of evidence that death had been cheated of its prize.
The change was instantaneous and miraculous, like watching someone rise from the dead. Color flooded back into Blackstone's face as oxygen rushed into his starved lungs, transforming him from a corpse-like blue back to the healthy pink of the living. He gasped and coughed violently, doubling over as his body remembered how to perform the basic function of breathing. Each intake of air a victory against the oblivion that had been reaching for him with cold fingers. The sound of his ragged breathing was the most beautiful music Emma had ever heard, better than any symphony or love song or lullaby. It was the sound of life returning, of death being denied its prize, of a human being snatched back from the very edge of eternity. The cabin exploded in applause and cheers that seemed to shake the very walls of the aircraft. Passengers rising from their seats to clap and whistle and shout as if they'd just witnessed a miracle rather than simply good training put to use in a crisis. The sound was deafening, a release of tension and fear and relief that had been building to an unbearable level. Dr. Morrison finally found his voice, shouting, "Magnificent! Absolutely magnificent! Textbook perfect!" While wiping tears from his own eyes, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of what he had just witnessed. Margaret Chen was openly sobbing with relief, her usual Silicon Valley composure completely abandoned as she clapped so hard her hands hurt. Even Thomas Bradley, the former Navy SEAL, was on his feet applauding, nodding at Emma with the kind of professional respect one warrior gives to another. Patricia Wellington had progressed from terrified screaming to joyful weeping, dramatically fanning herself with an in-flight magazine while declaring to anyone who would listen, "I've never seen anything so brave in my entire life! Never in my entire life!" But Emma only had eyes for Richard Blackstone. As he slowly straightened up, still gasping and coughing, one hand pressed to his chest and the other gripping the back of his seat for support, she saw something in his expression that she'd never seen in any of the photographs or news articles or business magazine profiles she'd encountered over the years. It wasn't gratitude, exactly, though that was certainly present. It wasn't relief, though he was clearly experiencing that as well. It was vulnerability. Raw, unfiltered, completely honest human vulnerability, of the kind that successful people spend their entire lives learning to hide from the world. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked softly, her hand still resting gently on his back, feeling the solid warmth of him and the steady rhythm of his breathing that proved he was indeed alive and well. "Do you need to sit down? Should I get you some water?" Blackstone turned to face her, moving slowly like a man who had just returned from a long journey to a foreign country, and Emma was shocked to see tears glistening in his steel-gray eyes like diamonds scattered across granite. For a moment he seemed unable to speak, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words adequate to the moment. When he finally did speak, his voice was hoarse and broken, stripped of the commanding authority that had made him famous in boardrooms around the world. "You," he whispered, then stopped, swallowing hard before trying again. "You saved my life." The words carried the weight of absolute certainty and wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "I was dying. I was actually dying, and you saved me." Emma felt her own eyes beginning to water as the adrenaline of the moment began to fade, replaced by the overwhelming realization of what had just occurred and how close they had all come to witnessing a tragedy. "I just did what anyone would have done," she said, though they both knew that wasn't true. Everyone else had frozen while she had acted. Everyone else had been paralyzed while she had moved. Everyone else had watched while she had saved a life. "No," Blackstone said, shaking his head slowly and emphatically, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not anyone. You did this. You chose to act when everyone else was frozen with fear." Without warning, he reached for her hands, clasping them between his own larger ones with a gentleness that surprised her. His skin was still clammy from his ordeal, but his grip was firm and warm, and somehow comforting. The gesture was intimate in a way that transcended their different social positions, a moment of pure human connection that had nothing to do with money or status or power. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gaining strength and authority with each word, though it retained that note of wonder that made him seem almost childlike in his curiosity.
"Emma Rodriguez," she replied, suddenly self-conscious about the tears she could feel starting to fall down her cheeks and the way her voice trembled with emotion. "I'm originally from Queens, but I live in Astoria now, and I've been working for United for 3 years, and I studied hospitality management at Queens College, and I'm sorry, I'm babbling. I just never expected anything like this to happen, and—" "Emma Rodriguez," Blackstone repeated, as if testing how the name felt on his tongue, rolling the syllables around like a fine wine he was trying to appreciate fully. "Emma Rodriguez from Queens." He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face from the stern, intimidating expression she'd seen in countless business photographs to something warm and almost boyish. It was nothing like the practiced, camera-ready smile she'd seen in magazines and newspapers over the years. This smile reached his eyes and made him look 20 years younger, erasing the lines of stress and calculation that usually marked his features. The entire first-class cabin had fallen silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of shock and horror that had gripped them during the medical emergency. It was the reverent quiet of people witnessing something profound and transformative. The kind of moment that changes the trajectory of lives and creates stories that get told for generations. Even the flight attendants from economy class had gathered at the partition to watch this unlikely tableau unfold, their own training temporarily forgotten in the face of something that felt more like a movie scene than real life. Carol Stevens, the head flight attendant who had worked for United for 15 years and prided herself on maintaining professional boundaries, found herself wiping away tears as she watched her junior colleague receive the kind of gratitude that most people only dream about. "Emma," Blackstone said, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that made it sound like music. "I want you to know that what you did here today, it changes everything. Everything." Before Emma could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, Carol Stevens approached them with the kind of careful deference she usually reserved for heads of state and A-list celebrities. "Mr. Blackstone," she said in her most professional voice, "we should probably have the medical team check you out when we land in London, just as a precaution. And Emma, you should probably get back to your duties. We still have the rest of the flight to complete."
Actually, Blackstone interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him one of the most feared negotiators in corporate America, I was hoping Emma might stay and talk with me for a few more minutes. If that's all right with her, of course. I'd like to know more about the woman who gave me back my life. Emma glanced nervously at Carol, who looked as if she'd rather swallow broken glass than leave a flight attendant chatting casually with a first-class passenger during active service. The head flight attendant's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, professional concern, and finally resignation, as she realized that even her authority as senior crew member wasn't enough to override the wishes of a man who had just nearly died, and whose airline loyalty program status was probably listed somewhere between Diamond Elite and God Tier. "Of course, Mr. Blackstone," Carol said through gritted teeth, her professional smile never wavering despite the clear struggle behind her eyes. "Emma, please make sure Mr. Blackstone has everything he needs, anything at all." As Carol retreated toward the galley, clearly flustered and muttering under her breath about protocols and procedures, Blackstone gestured toward the empty seat beside his with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed to belong to a different era. "Would you sit with me, please?" he asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in the request. "I promise I won't get you in trouble with your supervisor. I have some influence with airlines." Emma hesitated for just a moment, glancing around at the other passengers who were still stealing looks in their direction and whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Then she settled into the leather seat that probably cost more than her monthly rent, sinking into cushions that felt like they were made of clouds and butter. The contrast wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a girl from Queens, whose parents had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but dreams and determination, whose mother still cleaned houses for wealthy families on the Upper East Side, whose father worked 60-hour weeks managing inventory at a grocery store, now sitting beside a man whose great-great-grandfather had arrived on the Mayflower, and who now owned media outlets in 12 countries, luxury hotels on 3 continents, and a private jet that was larger than the apartment she shared with her roommate. But somehow, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. "Tell me about yourself, Emma Rodriguez," Blackstone said, turning his full attention to her with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. It was the kind of focused attention that successful people learn to deploy like a weapon, making the recipient feel like the most important person in the world. "I want to know everything about the woman who gave me back my life. Where did you grow up? What are your dreams? What makes you laugh? What keeps you awake at night?" And so, 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, with the engines humming steadily beneath them, and the other passengers pretending not to eavesdrop while hanging on every word, Emma found herself talking to Richard Blackstone as if they were old friends catching up over coffee at a neighborhood diner, rather than strangers from completely different worlds who had just shared the most intense experience of their lives. She told him about growing up in Queens, about the small apartment above her parents' grocery store where she had learned to speak Spanish and English with equal fluency, where the smell of fresh bread from the bakery next door mixed with the sounds of salsa music and children playing in the streets. She described her neighborhood, where everyone knew everyone else's business but also looked out for each other, where her mother's famous tamales were legendary among the local families, and her father's reputation for honesty had made their store a trusted institution. Blackstone listened with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly unnerving, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated he was truly paying attention rather than simply being polite. When she mentioned that her parents had worked double shifts for years to save money for her college education, his eyes seemed to soften with something that looked like respect.
When she talked about her dreams of traveling the world and how being a flight attendant had seemed like the perfect way to make that happen while earning a steady income, he nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. "You're remarkable," he said quietly when she paused to take a sip of the water he had insisted on ordering for her, and Emma felt her cheeks flush pink with embarrassment and pleasure. "Do you realize that? You work full-time in a demanding job. You help support your family financially. You're studying for your degree through night classes. And today, you saved a stranger's life without thinking twice about the personal risk or potential consequences. That's the definition of remarkable." Emma had never thought of herself as remarkable. She was just doing what needed to be done, the way her parents had taught her through their own example of hard work and sacrifice. But something in Blackstone's voice, in the way he looked at her as if she were the most fascinating person he'd ever met, made her wonder if maybe she was selling herself short, if maybe there was more to her than she had ever allowed herself to believe. "What about you?" she asked, deflecting the attention away from herself because praise had always made her uncomfortable. "I mean, I know you're successful in everything, but what do you actually do? Day to day, I mean, when you're not flying to London for mysterious business meetings." Blackstone laughed, a sound that was rich and warm and nothing like the cold chuckle she'd imagined based on his reputation in the business press. "I buy companies, mostly," he said, settling back in his seat like a man preparing to tell a long story. "I look for businesses that aren't living up to their potential, companies that have good bones but poor management or outdated thinking or insufficient capital to grow. Then I figure out how to make them better. Sometimes that means changing management, sometimes it means investing in new technology, sometimes it means completely reimagining what the company could become." He paused, studying her face carefully, as if trying to gauge her reaction. "Does that sound terrible to you? The media likes to paint me as some kind of corporate monster who destroys everything I touch, who ruins lives and crushes dreams for the sake of profit margins." Emma considered the question seriously, tilting her head as she thought about his words. "I don't know enough about business to say whether what you do is good or bad for the economy or for the people who work at those companies," she said honestly, choosing her words carefully. "But I know you just spent the last 20 minutes asking me about my life and my dreams and my family, and you haven't once made me feel like I'm beneath you or wasting your time, or that this conversation is some kind of charity on your part. That tells me something important about who you are as a person, regardless of what you do for work." The smile that spread across Blackstone's face was softer than before, touched with something that might have been wonder or gratitude, or perhaps simply the joy of being seen clearly by another human being. "You know what's funny?" he said, shaking his head slowly. "I was dreading this flight when I boarded this morning. I was going to London for a series of meetings that I expected to be tedious and frustrating, dealing with people who only want to talk to me because of what I can do for them financially. I had planned to work on the plane, to review contracts and financial reports, and prepare for negotiations that would probably drag on for days. And now," Emma prompted gently, sensing there was more to the story, "now I'm thinking this might be the best flight of my life," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made Emma's breath catch in her throat. Not the choking part, obviously, but everything that came after. Meeting you, talking to you, seeing myself through your eyes instead of through the lens of financial statements and stock prices. They were interrupted by the captain's voice crackling over the intercom, announcing that they would begin their descent into London Heathrow Airport in 30 minutes and asking all passengers to return to their seats and prepare for landing. The announcement broke the spell that had settled over their little corner of the cabin, reminding them both of the real world waiting below and the fact that this magical conversation couldn't last forever. "Emma, Blackstone said, his voice taking on a note of urgency that made her heart begin to beat faster. "I know this might sound crazy, and I know we've only been talking for a couple of hours, but would you consider having dinner with me tonight in London? I know you probably have protocols about fraternizing with passengers, and I know there's a significant difference in our circumstances, but I'd love to continue this conversation. I feel like we've just started getting to know each other." Emma's heart began to race as she considered his offer, her mind spinning through all the potential complications and consequences. There were indeed protocols about crew members socializing with passengers, especially first-class passengers, especially billionaire passengers who could probably buy and sell the airline if they wanted to. There was indeed a massive difference in their circumstances that went far beyond simple wealth to encompass education, social status, life experience, and cultural background. But there was also something in his eyes that made her want to throw caution to the wind for once in her carefully planned, responsibly managed life. Something that suggested this wasn't just a rich man's whim or a moment of gratitude that would fade once the adrenaline wore off, but a genuine desire to know her better as a person. "I have a layover until tomorrow evening," she heard herself saying, the words coming out before she could second-guess herself into silence. "I usually just stay at the crew hotel and rest, maybe do some studying for my classes, but?" Blackstone prompted hopefully, leaning forward slightly in his seat. "But I suppose I could make an exception," she finished, unable to suppress the smile that tugged at her lips. "Just this once." The joy that lit up Blackstone's face was worth any trouble she might get into with United Airlines, or any complications that might arise from crossing the invisible lines that usually separated people like them. It was the expression of a man who had just received an unexpected gift, pure and unguarded, in a way that transformed his entire appearance.
"There's a little restaurant in Covent Garden called Rules," he said eagerly, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. "It's been there since 1798. Nothing fancy despite its age, just good traditional British food and a quiet atmosphere where we can actually hear each other talk. Would 7 o'clock work for you? I could send a car to your hotel, or we could meet there, whatever makes you more comfortable." As the plane began its gradual descent toward London, banking gently to the left as it approached the sprawling metropolis below, Emma found herself agreeing to a dinner date, though neither of them called it that, with one of the most powerful men in the world. It should have felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in movies or romance novels. But somehow it felt perfectly natural, as if this was exactly where she was supposed to be at this moment in her life. The landing was smooth and professional, the kind of textbook approach that passengers barely notice. But Emma was hardly aware of the plane touching down or the gentle bump as the wheels made contact with the runway. She was too busy watching Blackstone gather his things, an expensive leather briefcase, a cashmere coat that probably cost more than her car, a phone that had been buzzing incessantly with messages and calls that he had been ignoring in favor of their conversation, and wondering what she had gotten herself into. As the passengers began to disembark in the usual chaotic fashion of international arrivals, he turned to her one final time, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a business card made of heavy cream-colored paper with elegant embossed lettering. "Emma," he said, pressing the card into her hand, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. "This has my private number on it. If you change your mind about dinner, or if anything comes up, or if you just want to talk, please call me. Don't worry about the time difference or whether I'm in a meeting. If you call, I'll answer." He paused, and that vulnerable look returned to his eyes, the same expression she had seen when he thought he was dying. "And
if you don't change your mind, if you do decide to have dinner with a grateful old man who would like to know you better, then thank you. For saving my life, yes, but also for reminding me what it feels like to have a real conversation with someone who sees me as a person rather than a portfolio."
She took the card, her fingers lingering against his for just a moment. The paper felt substantial and expensive, like everything else in his world, but his touch was warm and human and somehow comforting. "Thank you for asking," she said softly. "And for the record, you're not that old." Blackstone's laugh was genuine and delighted as he made his way off the plane, joining the stream of passengers heading toward customs and immigration. Emma caught sight of herself in the reflection of a cabin window as she began preparing for the turnaround flight. She looked the same as always, same brown eyes flecked with gold, same dark hair pulled back in the regulation bun that United required, same navy blue uniform that she'd worn thousands of times before. But something felt fundamentally different about the woman looking back at her. She felt different, as if the events of the last few hours had awakened some part of herself that had been sleeping. "Rodriguez!" Carol Stevens's sharp voice cut through her reverie like a knife through silk. "We need to prepare the cabin for the next flight. The cleaning crew will be here in 20 minutes, and we have a full passenger manifest for the return trip to JFK. This isn't a social club, and we're not running a matchmaking service for lonely billionaires." But as Emma went about her duties, stripping the beds in first class and preparing the cabin for the next group of passengers, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Richard Blackstone had looked at her. Not like a flight attendant whose job it was to serve him, not like someone whose existence was merely functional to his comfort, but like someone worth knowing, worth saving, worth whatever came next. That evening, as she stood in front of the narrow mirror in her small crew hotel room, Emma held Blackstone's business card in her trembling hands and felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a physical force. The card was beautiful in its simplicity, just his name, phone number, and email address embossed in dark blue ink on cream-colored paper that felt substantial and important between her fingers. No corporate titles or company logos, just the essential information needed for one human being to contact another. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy coat. Not just the dinner they had planned, though that was certainly significant enough, but everything that had led to this point, and everything that might flow from it. A few hours ago, she had been just another flight attendant on just another international route, serving champagne to wealthy passengers and counting down the hours until her shift ended. Now she was a woman who had saved a life, and in doing so, had somehow changed the entire trajectory of her own existence. She thought about her parents, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, who had worked 16-hour days for 20 years to give her opportunities they had never dreamed of having themselves. Her mother, who cleaned the homes of wealthy Manhattan families and never complained about the physical toll it took on her body. Her father, who had turned a small neighborhood grocery store into a community institution through sheer determination and an unwavering commitment to treating every customer with respect and dignity. What would they think of their daughter having dinner with a billionaire? Would they be proud of her courage in saving his life, or worried about her getting involved with someone so far outside their social world? Would they see it as an opportunity or a dangerous distraction from the practical goals they had sacrificed so much to help her achieve? She thought about her dreams of seeing the world and making a difference in it, dreams that had led her to choose a career that would let her travel while earning a steady income and benefits. She thought about her night classes in international relations, the degree she was pursuing one course at a time because she couldn't afford to stop working full-time.
She thought about her carefully mapped 5-year plan that included saving money, finishing her education, and eventually transitioning to a career in diplomacy or international development. And she thought about the way Blackstone's eyes had filled with tears when he realized he was going to live, the way his voice had broken when he thanked her, the way he had looked at her as if she were the most remarkable person he had ever met.
As she slipped into the simple black dress she had packed for emergencies, the kind of versatile piece that could work for a business dinner or a funeral with equal appropriateness, Emma Rodriguez from Queens made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. She was going to dinner with Richard Montgomery Blackstone III, not because of his money or his power or his influence, but because of the man she had glimpsed when he thought he was dying, vulnerable, grateful, and surprisingly kind beneath all that corporate armor. The taxi ride through London's evening traffic gave her time to second-guess her decision approximately 17 times. The driver, a cheerful Pakistani immigrant named Ahmed, who had been driving London cabs for 12 years, kept up a steady stream of conversation about the weather, the football matches, and the best places for tourists to visit, blissfully unaware that his passenger was having an internal crisis about whether she was making the biggest mistake of her life. "First time in London, love?" he asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror as they navigated the crowded streets of central London. "No, I've been here several times for work," Emma replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "But this is the first time I'm having dinner with someone I met on the plane." Ahmed chuckled knowingly. "Ah, a bit of romance in the air, is it? Well, Rules is a lovely choice for that. Very traditional, very romantic. Been taking couples there for years. The kind of place where gentlemen propose and ladies say yes." Emma's eyes widened in alarm. "Oh no, it's not like that. It's just dinner. Just a thank you dinner. Nothing romantic about it at all." But even as she said the words, she wondered if she was trying to convince Ahmed or herself. There had been something in Blackstone's eyes when he asked her to dinner, something that went beyond simple gratitude. And there had been something in her own response that went beyond polite acceptance of a kind invitation. The restaurant in Covent Garden was indeed small and unpretentious, exactly as Blackstone had described it. From the outside, it looked like the kind of establishment that had been serving London families for generations, with mullioned windows and a discreet wooden sign that spoke of understated elegance rather than flashy wealth. Emma arrived fashionably late, her heart pounding as she gave her name to the maitre d', who smiled warmly and led her through a dining room filled with dark wood paneling, hunting prints, and the soft murmur of intimate conversations. She found Blackstone in a corner booth, looking uncharacteristically nervous as he fiddled with his napkin and checked his watch for what was probably the dozenth time in 5 minutes. When he saw her approaching, he stood immediately, his face breaking into that transformative smile she was beginning to love, and she could see the relief in his posture as he realized she had actually come. "You came," he said, and she could hear the genuine surprise and gratitude in his voice, as if he had been half convinced that she would change her mind and leave him sitting alone in the restaurant. "Did you think I wouldn't?" she asked, as he helped her into her seat with old-fashioned courtesy that seemed natural rather than affected. "I hoped you would," he admitted, settling back into his own seat. "But I wouldn't have blamed you if you'd decided this was all too complicated, too risky, too far outside your normal life. I know what people say about me, about men like me. I know the assumptions people make." "What assumptions?" Emma asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on the social dynamics at play. Blackstone was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "That I'm used to getting what I want because of my money.
that I collect people the way I collect companies, as trophies or acquisitions, that a man in my position couldn't possibly have genuine feelings for someone in your position, that it must be some kind of power play or momentary whim.
He looked directly into her eyes, his expression serious and intent. I want you to know that's not what this is. What happened on that plane, Emma, I've never experienced anything like that. Not just the near-death part, though that was certainly memorable, but what came after. The way you looked at me, talked to me. You didn't see Richard Blackstone, the billionaire, or the corporate raider, or the media mogul. You just saw a person who needed help, and you helped him. Over dinner, simple but expertly prepared traditional British fare that reminded Emma of the comfort food her grandmother used to make, they talked as if they'd known each other for years rather than hours. The conversation flowed easily from topic to topic, ranging from serious discussions about social inequality and corporate responsibility to lighter exchanges about favorite books, travel experiences, and childhood memories. Emma learned that beneath the billionaire exterior, Richard Blackstone was a man who read voraciously, consuming everything from classic literature to contemporary fiction to dense academic papers on economics and social policy. He worried constantly about the impact of his business decisions on the lives of ordinary workers, often lying awake at night wondering if there was a way to create shareholder value while also creating meaningful employment and positive social change. I've been thinking about establishing a foundation, he told her over dessert, a shared plate of sticky toffee pudding that was probably worth a week of her salary but tasted like heaven. Something focused on educational opportunities for first-generation college students, particularly those from immigrant families. People like you, Emma, who have the intelligence and drive to succeed but need financial support and mentorship to reach their full potential. That sounds wonderful, Emma said, and she could hear the genuine enthusiasm in her own voice. Educational access is one of the most powerful tools for social mobility. My parents always said that education was the one thing no one could ever take away from you once you had it. Tell me more about your parents, Blackstone said, leaning forward with the kind of focused attention that made Emma feel like the most interesting person in the world. They sound remarkable.
So Emma told him about Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, about their journey from a small village in Oaxaca to the bustling streets of Queens, about the courage it had taken to leave everything they knew behind for the promise of opportunities for their children. She described her father's fierce work ethic and her mother's gentle wisdom, the way they had created a warm, loving home despite financial struggles that would have broken other families. They never made me feel like we were poor, she said, surprising herself with how easily the personal details came. Even when we were eating rice and beans for dinner 3 nights in a row, my mother would set the table with her good dishes and light candles, and somehow it felt like a feast. They taught me that dignity doesn't come from what you own, but from how you treat other people and how hard you're willing to work for your dreams. Blackstone listened with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated he was not just being polite, but genuinely wanted to understand her background and the experiences that had shaped her. When she mentioned that she was studying for her bachelor's degree in international relations through night classes and online coursework, his eyes lit up with what looked like genuine admiration and respect. "You're remarkable," he said quietly, and Emma felt her cheeks flush pink with embarrassment and pleasure. "Do you realize how extraordinary you are? You work full-time in a demanding job that requires you to be away from home for days at a time. You're pursuing your education despite the challenges of balancing work and study. You help support your family financially. And today, you saved a stranger's life without thinking twice about the personal risk or potential consequences. That's not just remarkable, Emma. That's heroic." Emma had never thought of herself as heroic. Heroes were people in movies and books, people who made grand gestures and saved the world from disasters. She was just doing what needed to be done, the way her parents had taught her through their own example of quiet courage and persistent effort. "I'm not a hero," she protested, uncomfortable with praise that seemed too large for her to carry. "I just have good training and quick reflexes. Anyone else would have done the same thing in that situation."
"No," Blackstone said firmly, shaking his head. "Not anyone else. There were other people on that plane with medical training, other people who knew what to do in an emergency. Dr. Morrison is one of the most respected surgeons on the East Coast, but he was frozen in his seat. You were the only one who acted, the only one who stepped forward when it mattered." He reached across the table and took her hand in his, the same gesture he had made on the airplane, but somehow more intimate in the candlelit atmosphere of the restaurant. "Do you know how long it's been since someone asked me about my dreams instead of my stock portfolio? Since someone challenged me to think about something other than profit margins and market share? Since someone looked at me and saw a person worth knowing rather than a bank account worth accessing?" That evening stretched into the early hours of the morning as they walked through London's quiet streets, their conversation continuing without pause or awkwardness. They talked about books and movies, about travel experiences and childhood memories, about hopes for the future and fears about the present. Emma found herself sharing stories she had never told anyone, including the time she had seriously considered dropping out of college because the financial pressure was becoming unbearable, and the way she sometimes felt caught between two worlds, too educated and ambitious for some of her childhood friends, but not wealthy or connected enough for the circles she encountered through her work. Blackstone, in turn, revealed a side of himself that never appeared in business magazines or newspaper profiles. He talked about the loneliness of success, the way wealth could isolate you from genuine human connection because you never knew if people liked you for yourself or for what you could do for them. He described the pressure of carrying the livelihoods of thousands of employees in his decisions, the weight of responsibility that kept him awake at night, wondering if there was a better way to create value that didn't come at the cost of human suffering. "I've been successful by any conventional measure," he said, as they paused on Westminster Bridge, looking out over the Thames and the illuminated Parliament buildings. "I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, more influence than most world leaders, more luxury than any human being could reasonably need. But I've never had what you have, Emma."
"What do I have?" she asked, genuinely puzzled about what someone in her position could possibly possess that he might envy. "Purpose," he said simply. "Connection to something larger than yourself. The knowledge that your work matters, that you make a difference in people's lives every day. When you saved my life today, you didn't do it for money or recognition or career advancement. You did it because it was the right thing to do, because another human being needed help and you were able to provide it." When he finally walked her back to her hotel, Emma found herself reluctant to say goodbye, reluctant to break the spell of this magical evening that had felt like stepping into someone else's life. The lobby was nearly deserted at this hour, with just a sleepy desk clerk and the soft sound of classical music playing from hidden speakers. "I have to ask," she said, as they stood near the elevator bank, both of them clearly reluctant to end the evening. "What happens now? I mean, you live in New York, I live in New York, but we inhabit completely different worlds. This feels like Cinderella, except the clock struck midnight hours ago, and I'm still here, and I'm not sure how this story is supposed to end." Blackstone was quiet for a long moment, his expression serious as he considered her question. When he spoke, his voice was firm with decision, and warm with something that might have been hope. "What happens now," he said, reaching for her hands in the gesture that was becoming familiar between them, "is that I prove to you that sometimes different worlds can find a way to coexist. What happens now is that I ask you to trust me, and I promise to be worthy of that trust." He squeezed her hands gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "Emma, I know this is unconventional. I know there are a million reasons why this shouldn't work, why a relationship between us would be complicated and challenging, and probably scrutinized by people who don't understand what we have. But I haven't felt this alive in years. You didn't just save my life on that plane. You reminded me what it means to actually live. Like this incredible story of unexpected love and courage, leave a comment telling us what you think happens next. And don't forget to hit that like button if Emma's bravery inspired you."
6 months later, Emma Rodriguez stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard's penthouse apartment, looking out at the Manhattan skyline that had once seemed so far above her reach, but now felt like home in ways she was still discovering. The view from the 45th floor of Blackstone Tower was breathtaking, encompassing everything from the Hudson River to Central Park to the glittering lights of the city that never slept. The transformation in her life had been gradual but profound. She was no longer a flight attendant, having accepted Richard's offer to help her transition to work that better matched her education and interests. She now worked as a program director at the Blackstone Foundation, overseeing educational initiatives for first-generation college students from immigrant families, work that felt like a perfect marriage of her personal experience and professional skills. The foundation had become her passion project, a chance to create the kind of opportunities for other young people that she had struggled to find for herself. Every scholarship they awarded, every mentorship program they funded, every educational partnership they established felt like a small victory against the barriers that kept talented, hard-working people trapped in cycles of limited opportunity. Richard emerged from his study, where he had been on a conference call with his London office about a potential acquisition that could create jobs for thousands of people in economically depressed regions of northern England. The sight of him still made her heart skip a beat, but now that feeling was tempered with the comfortable familiarity of deep love and genuine partnership. "How did the call go?" she asked, settling into his arms as naturally as breathing, still amazed by how perfectly she fit against his chest, despite the difference in their heights. "Better than expected," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head in a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. "The acquisition in Manchester is moving forward ahead of schedule, and we're looking at creating about 3,000 new jobs over the next 2 years. Good jobs with benefits and advancement opportunities." He paused, and she could hear the smile in his voice even before she looked up to see it. "But I have more important news. I got off the phone with your father 20 minutes ago."
Emma pulled back to look at him, confusion and curiosity written clearly across her face. "My father? Why were you talking to my father? Is everything okay? Is someone sick?" Richard's smile was nervous and excited and terrifying and wonderful all at once, the expression of a man about to take the biggest risk of his life. "Because I wanted to ask his permission for something very important, something I should have asked months ago but kept putting off because I was terrified you might say no."
And then, as Emma watched in stunned silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity, the most powerful man she had ever known, the billionaire who commanded respect in boardrooms around the world, dropped to one knee in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city where they had both been born and raised in such dramatically different circumstances. "Emma Rodriguez," he said, his voice thick with emotion and slightly shaky with nerves. "You saved my life in every way that a person can be saved. You showed me what it means to be brave, what it means to be kind, what it means to see the best in people even when they can't see it in themselves. You taught me that real wealth isn't measured in dollars or assets, but in the connections we make and the difference we make in other people's lives." The ring box he pulled from his jacket pocket was small and elegant, covered in midnight blue velvet that matched the color of the evening sky outside their windows. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you gave me on that plane?" The ring inside was beautiful, but not ostentatious, a perfect solitaire diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light from the city below and threw it back in rainbow patterns across the walls. It was elegant and classic, and exactly the kind of ring Emma would have chosen for herself if she had been brave enough to dream of such a moment. But Emma barely saw the ring through the tears that immediately sprang to her eyes and began rolling down her cheeks in streams of pure joy. Her hand flew to her mouth as if to catch the words that were trying to escape, and for a moment she couldn't speak at all, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment and the certainty of her answer. "Yes," she whispered, then louder and more confidently, "Yes, of course yes. How could I possibly say anything else?" As Richard slipped the ring onto her finger, with hands that trembled slightly with emotion and relief, Emma thought about the incredible chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A piece of lobster, a desperate emergency, a split-second decision to act when others froze, a dinner invitation that had seemed impossibly complicated just 6 months ago. Such small things that had led to such enormous changes, such ordinary moments that had become extraordinary through the simple act of one person choosing to help another. "Do you ever think about that flight?" she asked him later as they sat curled together on the couch that probably cost more than most people's cars, watching the sun set over the city and marveling at how their lives had become so beautifully intertwined. "Every single day," Richard admitted, pulling her closer against his chest where she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Not the choking part. Well, sometimes that too, usually when I'm eating lobster. But the moment when I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life was about to change completely. The moment when I looked into your eyes and saw the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life getting to know." Emma smiled, thinking about the girl from Queens who had started that day serving drinks and checking seatbelts at 37,000 feet, and had ended it saving a life and, unknowingly, changing the entire course of her own future. "My mom always said that you never know when an ordinary day is going to become the most important day of your life. She was right about that." "Smart woman, your mother," Richard said, chuckling as he remembered his first meeting with Maria Rodriguez, who had been politely suspicious of his intentions toward her daughter until he had sat in her kitchen for 3 hours, eating homemade tamales and answering increasingly pointed questions about his plans for the future. "I can't wait to make her my mother-in-law, though I suspect she's going to keep me on my toes for the next 50 years. Their wedding 6 months later was a study in contrasts that somehow worked perfectly together, a celebration that honored both their backgrounds while creating something entirely new. It was held at the Plaza Hotel, elegant and refined in the way that Richard's world demanded, But the guest list was a beautiful mixture that included everyone from Fortune 500 CEOs to the entire extended Rodriguez family, from Richard's business associates to Emma's childhood friends from Queens, from international diplomats to the staff of her parents' grocery store. Emma's wedding dress was a masterpiece of simple elegance, designed by Vera Wang, but incorporating lace from her grandmother's wedding dress and embroidered with symbols that told the story of her family's journey from Mexico to New York. Richard wore a classic tuxedo, but his boutonniere included a small piece of fabric from the United Airlines uniform Emma had been wearing the day they met, a private joke between them that made them both smile every time they looked at each other during the ceremony. The ceremony itself was conducted in both English and Spanish, honoring Emma's heritage while acknowledging the international scope of their combined future. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears streaming down his face, and Richard's eyes filled with emotion as he watched his bride approach, still amazed that this extraordinary woman had chosen to share her life with him. During his speech at the reception, Richard told the story of that flight to an audience that included some of the most powerful people in business, politics, and media, but he told it as if he were talking to old friends around a kitchen table. He described the terror of choking, the miracle of Emma's quick action, the unexpected conversation that had followed, and the way his entire understanding of what mattered in life had shifted in the space of a few hours. They say that when you're drowning, your entire life flashes before your eyes, he concluded, raising his champagne glass toward his new wife, who was radiant in her happiness and surrounded by the people who loved her most. But when I was choking on that plane, when I thought I was going to die 40,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, I didn't see my past. I didn't see the deals I'd made or the companies I'd bought or the money I'd accumulated.
He paused, his voice becoming softer and more intimate despite the microphone and the hundreds of people hanging on his every word. I saw my future. I saw Emma. I saw the life we could build together, the difference we could make in the world, the love that was possible if I was brave enough to reach for it. And I've spent every day since then grateful that she was brave enough to save a stranger's life and patient enough to teach him how to live it. The applause was thunderous and sustained, but Emma barely heard it. She was lost in her husband's eyes, still amazed by the journey that had brought them to this moment and excited about all the adventures that lay ahead. As the orchestra began to play their first dance, a song they had chosen together that spoke of unexpected love and second chances, Emma felt Richard's arms encircle her waist, and she marveled once again at the beautiful unpredictability of life and love. "No regrets?" Richard whispered in her ear as they swayed to the music, surrounded by everyone they cared about, but somehow alone in their own bubble of happiness. Emma looked around the ballroom at the faces of everyone they loved, at her parents beaming with pride, at Richard's business associates who had become genuine friends, at her college roommate wiping away happy tears, at the man who had become her anchor and her adventure all at once, at the life they were building together from the foundation of that one crucial moment when she had refused to stand by and watch someone suffer. "Only one," she whispered back, unable to keep the smile off her face. "What's that?" "I wish I could go back and tell that scared 26-year-old flight attendant from Queens that sometimes the most important thing you can do is exactly what feels right in the moment, even when everyone else is frozen with fear, even when you don't know what the consequences might be.
Richard spun her around in a move that would have seemed impossible for a man his age, and Emma laughed with pure joy as her wedding dress flared out around her like something from a fairy tale. When he pulled her back into his arms, his eyes were bright with the same wonder and gratitude she had seen that day on the plane. "You know what I think?" he said, holding her close as the music swelled around them. "What?"
I think she already knew that. I think that's exactly why we're here, why this is all possible. Because you've always been the kind of person who acts when action is needed, who steps forward when others step back, who sees what needs to be done and does it regardless of the personal cost or complications. As they danced beneath the crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across the walls, Emma Rodriguez Blackstone, a name that still made her smile every time she heard it, thought about the courage it takes to act when action is needed, the strength required to open your heart to unexpected possibilities, and the magic that happens when two people from different worlds discover they're heading to the same destination after all. 2 years later, as she stood at the podium of the United Nations headquarters in New York, addressing delegates from around the world about the importance of educational access and economic opportunity, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The Blackstone Foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams, funding educational programs in 12 countries and directly impacting the lives of over 50,000 young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Richard sat in the front row, his face glowing with pride as he watched his wife command the attention and respect of world leaders and policymakers. The girl from Queens who had once served him champagne at 37,000 feet was now recognized as one of the leading voices in international development, and he couldn't have been more proud if she had been his own daughter. In her speech, Emma talked about the power of education to transform lives, about the importance of creating opportunities for young people regardless of their background or circumstances, about the responsibility that successful people have to lift others up rather than simply accumulating more wealth and power for themselves. But she also talked about unexpected moments of connection, about the way a single act of kindness or courage can change the trajectory of multiple lives, about the importance of being ready to act when the moment calls for action.
3 years ago, she said, looking directly at Richard, I was working as a flight attendant when I encountered an emergency that required immediate action. I had a choice in that moment. I could have frozen like many others did. I could have waited for someone else to take responsibility. I could have assumed that someone more qualified would handle the situation. The room was completely silent, delegates and observers hanging on her every word. Instead, I acted. Not because I was particularly brave or heroic, but because my training and my upbringing had taught me that when someone needs help, you help them, period. That single moment of action changed not just one life, but 2 lives, and eventually many more lives as we've worked together to create opportunities for others. She smiled, her eyes finding Richard's across the room. The lesson isn't that we should all hope for dramatic moments to prove our character. The lesson is that we should be prepared to act with courage and compassion when ordinary moments call for extraordinary responses. Because you never know when the most routine day of your life will become the most important day of your life. The standing ovation that followed went on for several minutes, but Emma barely noticed. She was thinking about that flight, about the choice she had made without thinking, about the ripple effects that continued to spread outward from that single moment of decision. After the speech, as they walked through Central Park hand in hand, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the changing leaves, Richard squeezed her hand and smiled at her with the same expression of wonder and gratitude that had never quite left his face since that day on the plane. "Proud of you," he said simply. "Proud of us," she replied, squeezing back. "Proud of what we've built together." The flight that had started as just another workday had become the journey of a lifetime, and they were still discovering new destinations together. And as they walked through the park where they had had their first date in New York, past the benches where other couples were writing the beginnings of their own love stories, Emma Rodriguez Blackstone smiled and thought about how beautiful it was when two people chose to save each other, over and over again, in all the ways that really mattered. If this incredible story of courage, love, and the power of unexpected connections moved you, please share it with someone who needs to believe that ordinary moments can become extraordinary when we choose to act with kindness and bravery. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply be ready to help when help is needed. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for our next amazing story of real human connection that will restore your faith in the power of love to change everything, one courageous act at a time.